In this video, I'm going to talk about the second principle of art, which is contrast. And contrast is arguably one of the most important principles in all of photography because everything in your image centers around it. So within this video, I'm going to break down what exactly contrast is. Then I'm going to break down how you can use contrast using different elements of design. So let's start with what contrast is. So contrast is essentially when you align two opposing elements in a shot next to each other. And there's three main reasons you'd want to do this. For one, it creates meaning within your shots. So when your mind sees two opposing elements, it's forced to compare and contrast those elements. Thus, it gives each element a solid definition to understand what it is. Secondly, it creates excitement in your shots. So when you have two opposing forces next to each other, it creates a source of tension, which is attractive to the mind. Notice how people always like talking about drama or gossip when you see humans interacting. It's the same thing with nature. So if you see opposing elements next to each other interacting, it creates that drama which captivates the mind. The third reason is the most important. So wherever you have contrast in a shot, that's where your subject's going to be. So thus, contrast creates a subject. So as you're going to see in the following examples of contrast, wherever the subject is the most contrast within your shot. So with that being said, let's dive into how we can use contrast using different elements of design. And I want to start with lines. So the first way you can use contrast with lines is to have opposing lines. So for example, something that's perpendicular and intersecting with each other. So the example I wanted to show you is this image right here. So as you can see, we have a highway overpass that's going in one direction along with a bridge. And then in the other direction, we have a huge canyon that just leads into darkness. So we have these two opposing forces contrasting each other in different lines. So we can use those directions of the lines to create a metaphor for nature, which is that cavern, versus man-made, which is those highways, and man-made conquering nature by going over the top of it. So using those lines to create those opposing forces. Secondly, we can also determine frequency of lines to show contrast. So for example, in this image right here, so as you can see, we have those bigger lines that are making up the foundations of this pyramid. This was taken, I believe, in Guatemala. And then we also have a smaller frequency of lines where the staircase should be in that pyramid. So now we're creating a story for the viewer because the staircase is where you walk up and the bigger lines are the foundation. So frequency is the major player here. And then finally, we can show contrast in line through the type of line. So say we want to connect different types of line together. For example, in this shot right here. So as you can see, we have that man-made line of the pathway leading up to that little house. And then in the distance, that river actually connects that line as well, except they are two contrasting types of lines. We have one that's a path made by man, and then another we have that river that's made by nature. So thus, we are therefore connecting nature and man through two different lines. So this is kind of the opposite of that first shot I showed you, where we have those two contradictory lines coming together. So contrast can be used to show opposition or even harmony in certain cases. And fun fact about that building, it was actually constructed with the idea of having that line intersect with the river to create that nice S shape. So this doesn't just apply to photography art in general, it could apply to even architectural and landscape design. Another element of design that you can show contrast in is shapes. And shapes is a bit more obvious, but I have a really good example I wanted to show you. So check out this shot right here. So we have this ceiling that was taken on the roof of the Church of Cannabis in Colorado. So the idea behind this entire church is that cannabis is the sacred sacrament of it, and everything revolves around that. So by showing all those different wild shapes in the ceiling, we're creating an idea of chaos and hallucinations within the mind. So thus, we're telling a story using the shapes of contrast in this shot here. All right, so now let's talk about contrast of form within a shot. And form is one of the more difficult elements to find contrast in, but there are ways to do it. So essentially, you want to contrast the notion of something being 3D versus something being 2D. So let me show you this example right here, which I was able to construct. As you can see, we have that cliff in the background and the two people standing on it in the top left in the distance. But we also have in the bottom right, we have a hole in that cliff and there's a river of water coming through it. So it's actually a sea stack with a hole in it where the ocean comes in and out of it. So thus we're creating that diagonal and giving that 3D element with the water in the bottom right. And then in the top left, we have that 2D element of the people silhouetted in the top corner. So now we're contrasting that 2D and that 3D notion. So it's a great way to make shots and subjects stand out in your images. The fourth element I wanted to talk about is color. So how can we show contrast of color? And the most obvious way to do this is through the color wheel. So if you go back to the color video, if you find complementary colors, they pair very well nicely together. For example, this image right here. So you can see we have this red leaf and that green moss in the background. Very nice complementary colors. They contrast very well, and we are pointing at that red subject in the middle. So that's the obvious way to do it. The next way to use color, which is one of my favorite ways, is through use of saturation. So one thing I like to do is when you pick out your subject in a shot, make it more saturated than other parts of the photo. And you could do this either really subtly or very intensely. So for example, check out this image right here. So this is a shot of a theater taken in Boulder. And as you can see, it was taken at night and we only have those glowy colors in the shot. So it's almost got this cyberpunk or Blade Runner type of feel to it. And the color is the subject of the shot. So at its most extreme, this is a perfect example. On the other side of the spectrum, you could do this very subtly. So check out this image, for example. So this is El Capitan in Yosemite. And as you can see, I got the shot right when the sunlight was hitting that very peak of the mountain. So it almost looks like a colossus of sorts. And you'll notice that that is one of the most saturated parts of the image because that's where I want you to draw your eyes toward. So you can just subtly desaturate the other parts of the image to really draw attention to a certain area. So use color wisely. Next up, let's talk about contrast of textures. So how can we make one part of the image feel a certain way and another part feel a completely different way? And how does that make the mind feel when we combine them? So one of my favorite examples of this is this shot that I got right here. So this was taken at a raging river in Colorado. And as you can see, I got a long exposure on that water. So we have this nice silky smooth stream that is raging through the canyon. And then to contrast that, we have a nice pine tree in the middle. And as we all know, pine trees are very prickly, they're pointy, they kind of hurt if you just grab them really hard. So we have that contrast of spikiness and smoothness in the image that's pulling this whole shot together to make an awesome shot. Another way to use texture that I like that isn't very popular is to put your subject out of focus. So this is against the norms of most photography. You know, mainstream advice says always have your subject in focus, but sometimes I like to put it out of focus just to stir things up a little bit. So check out this shot, for example, here. So as you can see, I'm laying on that hammock in the background, clearly the subject of the shot, but in the foreground, I have that tree with that blade of grass in the shot. So now I am smoothing out the backdrop there, almost in a way to say that smoothness is related to calmness and tranquility and relaxation. So I'm connecting those feelings with that subject matter in the back and then opposing it to those grass blades in the front and showing nature. So opposing textures through aperture in a lens. And you could also do this just for fun in shots like this. So obviously the chick is the main subject of the shot here, but I thought it would be fun to actually make the background of that island in the distance the part that's in focus. So now we have this almost cool surrealist type of version of the girl. It's like a portrait, but you know, it's a bit more abstract and plays with the mind a bit differently. So if you're ever in a place where you're not sure how to stir up a photo, perhaps you're just getting bored of shooting the same thing, try putting your subject out of focus and see how you can create that tension in an image. Value is another popular element for contrast. So value is obviously lightness and darkness in an image. So if you can have elements of darkness and lightness in a shot, you can show value very easily. And one of the most popular ways to do this is through silhouettes. So you pick a subject and then you silhouette it against something that's very bright behind it. So this means your subject is usually very dark and the background is very bright. So for example, check out this shot right here. So this was taken at a underpass cave and we have that chick that is silhouetted against that bright light in the background. and it almost creates this James Bond underground secret tunnel vibe to it. So it's a great way to make a subject. And you could also do this a little bit more subtly, so it doesn't have to be that harsh white contrasted by that harsh black. You could do this something more subtle, for example, with this shot right here. So as you can see, this bird is flying in front of the sun there. We still have a wide variety of colors in the shot, and the sun isn't pure white, but it is bright enough to be able to contrast that bird and create a subject in this shot. And then finally, the main notion behind value is that the eye is always drawn to what is most white. So if you want to have a white spot in your image, make it the subject of the shot. So speaking of birds, check out this shot right here. So this was a drone shot taken of some sea stacks from above, and that rock is actually covered in white because it is completely covered in bird shit. So obviously, that's the first place that your eye goes to this shot, and the reason that I really liked this image as a subject. For example, there were a ton of other sea stacks next to it that I could have gotten, but none of them had that white bird shit in it. So the black and darkness of the rocks blended in with the ocean, and it just didn't make a very good shot. So that white is now what I'm using to draw the eye to that point. And there is an exception to this rule, however. If you have pure black in an image, so for example, all the way black, not even slightly gray, your eye will get drawn to that point as well. So use that information wisely. Generally, as I've said in the dynamic range and exposure videos, you don't want to have black points in your shot, but you can find ways to use it artistically if you want to draw the eye to those black points. So for the most part, it's drawn to light parts, but if you have a totally black point in the shot, it would also be drawn to that. The final element that I wanted to talk about with contrast is space. So obviously the first thing that's going to come to mind when you think of contrast and space is going to be positive and negative space. So having a good, healthy amount of positive and negative space within a shot is a great way to show contrast. So if you check out this image right here, as you can see, we have me silhouetted against that white steam. This was actually taken at a geyser in Yosemite, and we have that dark forest in the top behind it. So we're using a ton of negative space up there, and we're also using positive space to create a negative space for me as a silhouette in that shot right there. So finding creative ways to use space and contrast it with each other. And then finally, the last example I want to show you is this image right here. So you could also use space to contrast certain ideas. So we have this forest right here, and then we have a plain in the middle of it. So now we're contrasting man and nature, again, like we talked about in the very beginning of this video. So all of these different elements that you can use can also be symbolism for themes like man versus nature, or young versus old, or, you know, busy versus tranquil. Whatever opposing themes you could find, you can connect that in nature with certain metaphors. So it's not just limited to what the exact element is. So keep that in mind. And that's contrast. So the main idea, always be looking for contrast in your shots. And if you do have a subject, how can we contrast that with the environment around it? So move around and find a way to isolate it or create tension. And that is a great way to go about with your photography. So let's jump into the next video.